Hello, I'm Louisa Pilbeam. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Donald Trump again takes aim at Brics. He's threatening to impose more tariffs on nations aligning themselves with the bloc. But Brics nations have vowed to double down on efforts to move away from the dollar. So can they challenge the US-led world order? Raking in billions of dollars from the genocide in Gaza, the UN Special Rapporteur says global companies should be held accountable for profiting from the war on the Strip and occupation in Palestine. Europe's heatwave is threatening lives and livelihoods. Insurers warn extreme weather conditions could reduce the continent's economic output. But who foots the bill? It accounts for 40% of the world's population and the global economy. The Brics bloc of developing nations aims to challenge the dominance of the dollar and the US-led economic order. In theory, it has the clout to push through reforms to global governance. But critics say the expanded group faces rifts among its members. The coherence of the bloc was put into question after China's President Xi Jinping skipped this year's summit for the first time in 12 years. Although Brics leaders have criticised US policies, including trade tariffs, during the gathering in Brazil's Rio de Janeiro, they shied away from naming Washington directly. President Donald Trump responded by accusing the bloc of being anti-American and threatening a 10% levy on any country that aligns itself with Brics policies. So, does the bloc really pose a threat to the American financial system, and can it challenge the existing world order? Katia Lopez-Horoyan reports.
It's a unique time for leaders of some of the world's top emerging economies. At this year's summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brics members stand together, demanding a new global order that doesn't revolve around the US dollar. Brics countries make up about half of the world's population and 40% of its GDP. The bloc, which includes China, Russia, India, and Brazil, hopes to rival the US-led G7, both as a geopolitical and economic force, particularly amid President Donald Trump's widespread tariffs.
So we don't want an emperor. Our countries are sovereign. If Trump issues tariffs, other countries have the right to do the same. There is the reciprocity law.
On day one of the summit, the bloc condemned sanctions, unilateral tariffs, and strikes on Iran.
Because Brics was set up to hurt us. Brics was set up to degenerate our dollar.
But Trump responded with a warning, threatening to add an extra 10% tariff on nations that side with Brics and against American interests. Fueled in part, perhaps, by discussions to lessen their reliance on the US dollar and create a new banking system for financial transfers. China's President Xi Jinping did not attend the summit in Brazil, but Beijing's position is clear.
Brics does not engage in bloc confrontation and is not targeted at any specific country. As far as additional tariffs, we have reiterated our position many times that there are no winners in trade wars or tariff wars, and protectionism leads nowhere.
Trump's approach, some argue, could backfire, emboldening Brics leaders to unite against his trade wars with new alliances and policies. But critics insist Brics has limitations that hinder it from challenging the U.S. and its Western allies. Some see it as an opportunity.
There is a very big concern about trade. In other words, how is it that the countries that are part of Brics are going to improve and actually increase the level of trade and the level of business at large that they can have with each other?
Brics nations have the potential to become global economic powers by the year 2050. The question is whether a new economic model will emerge that doesn't rely on the dollar or on Washington. Katia Lopez-Horoyan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Currently, 10 countries make up BRICS. There's the original 5, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Also on the list is Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Indonesia and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia is on the fence, still considering whether to officially join. The group's economic influence is significant. BRICS says trade among its members reached more than $420 billion in 2020. In comparison, though, trade between the US and the EU reached around $2 trillion last year. The bloc has long supported efforts to de-dollarize global trade and use alternative payment systems. It's also promoted trade using their national currencies. BRICS is looking to rival the US-led G7 by highlighting growing economies in the global south. In 2024, the G7's combined GDP was roughly $46 trillion, while BRICS GDP was at $29 trillion. But the bloc has surpassed the G7's share of the world's GDP in terms of purchasing power parity. Well, let's bring in our guests now. In Brasilia is Gustavo de Carvalho, a senior researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs. And in London is Philippe Legrand, a senior visiting fellow at the London School of Economics European Institute. If we could start with you, Gustavo, thank you both for joining us. Gustavo, I'm starting with you because you were actually in Rio at the summit. One person who wasn't there, though, was the Chinese president. Was that disappointing and was it a sign of division within BRICS?
Thank you very much. And I think while President Xi Jinping didn't come to the summit here in Brazil, I think the big question is, did China engage any less since January when the negotiations towards the summit started? And I think China was still an incredibly active country within the negotiations. We still see a lot of the Chinese language within that. There's speculations around what was the reason, whether it was because President Lula was hosting Prime Minister Modi for a private dinner. I think the most plausible speculation at this point regards the reciprocity of visits, considering that Xi Jinping was in Brazil fairly recently for the G20. But I think it also provides an image that BRICS move on, even when the largest economy, the largest partner, does not send its highest level representative. And the outcomes really showcase this idea of consensus building that is quite important for BRICS, that it's a mix of, on the one hand, a process-driven approach, but also seen as a value. That is the way in which members see to agree to disagree within all of the different layers and levels and sectors of discussions that are occurring on a daily basis, effectively within the BRICS context.
Philippe, bringing you in here, do you think it was damaging not to have the leader of BRICS' largest economy for the first time in 12 years? Was it damaging for him not to be there?
Well, we don't know why President Xi was unable to attend. It certainly was a surprise, given that he's previously placed great importance on BRICS. So we don't know whether it's for domestic political reasons or indeed something to do with the BRICS summit itself. You would have thought he would want to be there, given that it marked the enlargement of BRICS, which was a key Chinese objective, and that generally China wants to pose as a responsible global player, and this was an opportunity to do that.
Gustavo, we heard from Donald Trump. He threatened during this summit an extra 10% tariff on imports from BRICS countries and any country aligning themselves with BRICS. What do you make of BRICS' response to that? In their statement, they stopped short of naming the US even, while they did criticise trade tariffs in general.
So when we're talking about the timing of what happened this week is quite an interesting one, considering that the negotiations that led to the declaration that were approved on Saturday were very much geared towards reducing the level of confrontation with the United States, avoiding naming the US directly in any language, and particularly those related to the tariff wars and the confrontation around that space. And immediately after, we see President Trump not only threatening the increase in tariffs, but effectively announcing tariffs to South Africa on 30% and also Brazil on 50%, of tariffs around that. I think to a certain degree, what becomes unclear for a lot of BRICS members, what is realistically what the United States want. Because when we're talking about processes of moving away from the dollar, I think they're very specific when it comes to the utility. Most BRICS members are not really looking into moving away from the US dollar at this stage, but they do see the dollar as a much riskier asset when it comes to their ability of engaging in the long term and seeing the dollar less as a common public good, but more as a political asset that the United States at times utilize. So, but at the same time, the processes that will lead towards trading, settling trade with local currencies and the creation of a systems of payments intra-BRICS, that is going to take a much longer time. So if we are looking for reactions that are based on evidence of actions that are occurring at this stage, we have very limited evidence to back Donald Trump's threats. Certainly, there are already some action around that, limited of action when it comes to the summit has already ended and the declaration is already over, and those new tariffs that have been imposed, particularly on South Africa and Brazil, they will not necessarily allow the members to really dialogue and negotiate at this stage, but we certainly should expect the group to look into that with much more caution and perhaps even some action in the coming weeks and months.
Well, we'll pick up on the dollar a little bit later, but Philippe, I just want to get your thoughts on those negotiations and Trump's tariffs. I mean, could his approach backfire? Because could the BRICS unite against him, do you think?
Well, I think obviously the BRICS themselves are united. Indeed, the whole world is united in opposing the Trump's tariffs, his reckless disregard for the world trading system, and his attempt to bully the rest of the world. At the same time, they're all acting individually, whether that's the BRICS or elsewhere. You can see that China has taken a very confrontational approach, where other countries have been much more conciliatory. You can see that each country is negotiating with Trump individually. India is trying to strike a much better deal. Vietnam, one of the new BRICS partner countries, has just struck a deal with Trump, which provides for higher tariffs for transshipped exports, notably those from China. So while you can have agreement that Trump's tariffs are bad, I don't think you're going to have a collective action by the BRICS in response to it.
OK, Gustavo, I just want to bring you back in on some of the points you were making about the dollar. Donald Trump has said that BRICS was set up to harm the dollar. BRICS nations are trying to decrease their dependency, though, on the dollar. Are they succeeding there?
It's a multi-layered effort within BRICS in terms of, first, how do we increase complementarity of our economies? How do we start trading more with one another? If we're looking to the intra-BRICS trade, there is a very imbalanced structure at the moment where most members and all members trade a lot with China, but we don't trade so much with one another. So we're looking into approaches as countries to reduce not necessarily the utility of the US dollar, but to create options to diversify those risks. And the US dollar currently is seen as an inherently risky asset and an inherently risky way of trading with one another. I think for me that it's perhaps more fundamentally important into the tone of the negotiations and the decisions that have been taken, much rather than putting the centrality entirely on BRICS as a confrontation to the United States or the West in itself. I think there is elements of a much more positive incorporation of BRICS elements internationally. If we're looking to the positive tone and the support that BRICS has provided to multilateral institutions, for me that really showcases that BRICS is far less about changing the global order, but much more about having a space and a seat at the table within that order that seems to benefit itself quite largely.
Philippe, what are your thoughts there? Do you think that Donald Trump's fears are right? Do you think that BRICS is trying to undermine the dominance of the dollar?
I think Gustavo made a very interesting point there. which is that the BRICS wasn't mainly about reforming the global order, but rather about having a bigger say. And I think that those desires are clearly legitimate because the existing institutions, political and economic, are dominated by the US and the West. Where I think that there's an issue is that there's a disagreement about what form that reform should take, where China, for example, sees itself as leading an opposing bloc to the US, whereas Brazil and India want to be aligned with both camps and are much more conciliatory. Some favor reform of the existing institutions, and Gustavo was right to point out that now that Trump is trying to wreck them, that suddenly the BRICS countries realize that they quite like the liberal rules-based order, of which they were previously quite critical. And others are looking to substitute new institutions. Those are the BRICS themselves, or indeed the ones that China has developed itself.
Philip Legrain, thank you very much for joining us. And Gustavo de Carvalho in Brasilia, thank you for being with us as well. She's described it as Israel's economy of genocide. The United Nations Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories has accused some of the world's largest companies of profiting from Israel's military actions in Gaza and in the occupied West Bank in breach of international law. Francesca Albanese has called for sanctions and an arms embargo on Israel and for global corporations to be held accountable for their actions. Israel and some of the companies named in the report have rejected her findings as groundless, while the Trump administration has imposed sanctions on Albanese over her efforts to have the International Criminal Court take action against US and Israeli officials and companies. Here are some of the companies listed. Big tech firms like IBM, Microsoft, Google, Amazon and AI firm Palantir are listed as helping Israel with surveillance, crowd control, urban warfare, facial recognition and targeted killings. Tourism giants, including Booking.com and Airbnb, are accused of advertising rental properties and hotel rooms in illegal Israeli settlements on occupied land. The report says major construction companies like Caterpillar, Volvo and Hyundai have for decades provided Israel with equipment to demolish Palestinian homes and build illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Several banks, insurance companies and investments have effectively underwritten Israel's war machine to the tune of billions of dollars. And British Petroleum has acquired licenses to explore maritime territory that belongs to Palestine. Al Jazeera spoke with UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese. We started by asking her about her findings on the economic framework that's enabled Israel's war on Gaza.
I did realize throughout 2024 that there were a number of actors without whom Israel would have not been able to commit the acts of genocide it has committed. And this is why I started investigating. I had a call for submissions, which was met by an unprecedented response. I received 200 submissions that led to the setup of a database of 1,000 entities, over which I could only investigate a small number. But I can tell you what is the most precious legacy of my investigation is that it explains a system which could have been seen, again, the economy of the occupation made of entities profiteering from the displacement and replacement of the Palestinians and also enabling it, lending funds, lending legitimacy. But then all this has turned into profits. I think that the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has increased its value of about 170%, amassing $220 billion since October 2023, 70 billion of which in the last month. You see it. So there is, while the Palestinians are being erased and their life is being destroyed, some, I wouldn't even say Israelis, some are also profiting out of the Israeli disgrace, because many sectors of the Israeli economy are nosediving. And still, there are people who are becoming rich out of this out of these crimes. They should face investigation and prosecution, and this can be done at international or national level. There is nothing that prevents, actually, rather the contrary. What I'm trying to say is that the legal framework is strong enough, despite what companies and some states seem to say, the legal framework is strong enough to hold them accountable. Because again, the occupation is so unlawful and the red lines have been crossed across the border. But these companies should have pulled out from their engagement with Israel as it was committing such egregious violations of international law, the violation of the right of self-determination of the Palestinians, perpetual occupation, annexation. All the more at the time it has pulverized Gaza. So not only they have not disengaged, they have continued to maintain, to support, to lend the means, legitimacy, credibility, and sometimes profiting themselves from this endeavor. Therefore, they must be held accountable. I want to reassure everyone that despite what some member states says, this report is not a threat to the global economy. I'm not advocating for an end of the market. I'm just saying that the market must follow some rules. And when state conduct turns into killing and slaughtering, maiming, starving adults and children alike, including babies, we have crossed that red line. So now, yes, there is, if Palestine was a crime scene, it would have, I've said to the Human Rights Council, the fingerprints of all of us. In the sense, all of us are somewhat involved in this. Doesn't mean that all of us are complicit, but we have power. We have power to influence the companies, both as users and as shareholders.
A heatwave has gripped many parts of Europe, leaving millions of people struggling to adapt to record-breaking temperatures. Spain and England have recorded their hottest June ever, and countries including Turkey and France have been hit by wildfires. That has affected people's ability to do their jobs, while dry weather conditions have reduced crops and dried up shipping routes. Allianz Insurer warns extreme weather conditions could slow economic growth in Europe by 0.5 percentage point this year. And the European Central Bank has warned heat waves could push up prices and fuel inflation. Christina Harazim reports.
Labourers across Europe are facing the dangers of doing their jobs in the heat wave. And as temperatures rise to record levels, productivity melts away.
We must do many breaks, and normally we do 100 meters, but at this time we can do 60, 50.
Temperatures in parts of Spain have hit more than 46 degrees, a record for the time of year. In Madrid, as well as other tourist hotspots, restaurants that would normally be packed with tourists have been deserted during the hottest hours.
Madrid is a city with a lot of public space, outdoor leisure and seating, tables in the sun, and all that consumption, particularly in the hottest and harshest hours of the day, from 4 o'clock in the afternoon to 7 o'clock, is practically reduced to zero and is limited only to the interior establishments.
Profits are being hit, and others are finding their income is at risk.
If it's 40 degrees in the street, then it's 45 or 46 inside the gorilla. I'm stuck inside and it's hard to breathe. You get dehydrated, headaches, nausea, and feel like vomiting. The problem in the heat is that the tourists don't come out during the day because of the heat waves, the sun. I do this for my family, to work and survive. Otherwise we'd be on the streets dying of hunger.
In Paris, the summit of the Eiffel Tower has been closed as temperatures were classed as dangerous for tourists. In Greece, the country's most popular tourist site, the Acropolis, has also been partially closed. Greece has seen wildfires, as well as Germany and Spain. This, as a new report from the European Environment Agency shows that Europe has suffered its highest economic losses in the 21st century from natural hazards, more than $900 billion between 1980 and 2023. With climate experts predicting heat waves will become more common in the coming years, the cost will not only be greater to the environment, but to economies too. Christina Harrism, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Johan Beckford is a senior policy advisor at Green Alliance. That's an environmental policy think tank, and he joins us from London. Johan, thank you for joining us on the programme. So just how damaging are these heat waves to European economies?
Extreme heat can be really, really significant, and the damages can be quite wide-ranging, as your package showed. I mean, in the UK, where I'm sat, for example, we lost an estimated 11 million labour hours in the heat waves of 2022, which was, the first time where we recorded a 40 degrees Celsius temperature in this country, which is not something we're necessarily known for. But estimates suggest that the kind of impacts will be most significant in those parts of Europe where we see those highest heats, as your package showed, again, parts of the south of Europe. But I think what's important to note is that where we aren't particularly well adapted to high heat, actually the impacts can be felt across the board. So this will be felt across large parts of the continent.
Yeah, and we are recording this in Doha, where I feel rather guilty. We have extensive aircon, but I do have a point, because we've been watching there about which sectors are particularly vulnerable to heat waves. So outside labour, agriculture, and then tourism, of course. But should these countries with increasing heat waves, should they be investing now in the infrastructure to help them cope?
Absolutely. So you're right to point out there that the sectors most impacted are those where we can't necessarily shelter or mitigate the heat in most directly. So construction, agriculture, as you say, can be really, really impacted. But actually, it is across the board. So the infrastructure, as you say, it can shut down our sort of transport networks, which can be fundamental to connecting our economies. In the UK, again, where I am, often you see things like railways buckling, roads melting. So actually parts of the country, parts of the economy are effectively shut down by this. And obviously it has an impact on tourism, which can very, very directly, the tourists themselves can very directly feel the heat and choose not to go out. So absolutely we need to invest in the infrastructure that we have. So I think there's an interesting point here that if we're already moving towards a net zero economy, there's actually an opportunity to embed resilience within that change as well. So it's really crucial that politicians understand that those two things have to work together. And whilst we're moving towards a net zero economy for the future, we need to embed that resilience as well.
And Johan, just briefly, who is picking up the bill for this? Is this governments, insurance companies?
With environmental impacts as they are felt right now, the costs are actually being borne by citizens. As your package showed, the businesses that are losing out because the tourists aren't coming to their cafes, to their shops. And actually, if you look again on a slightly bigger scale, it is often those countries that have had less to do with the causing of climate change. Large parts of Africa, which are seeing long-lasting droughts. You see even parts of the periphery of Europe are seeing really, really devastating wildfires and long heat waves. And actually, they're often the countries that had less of a role in causing climate change. And even within countries themselves. So we see that it is the poorest often that are trapped in low quality housing that's poorly adapted. So that shows that this is a really whole society and whole economy issue. And that's something that we have to collectively work together. It's households, it's government and it's business.
OK, well, Johan, I wish you luck keeping cool in the heat wave in London. Thank you very much for joining us. Johan Beckford. And that is our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X. I'm at Louisa Pilbeam TV, and use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Louisa Pilbeam from the whole team. Thank you for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is up next.